To discuss more about inflation levels in Indonesia and to gauge the overall health, of the Indonesian economy, we are now joined by Muhammad Faisal. He's the executive director of the Core Indonesia think tank. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us again on Jakarta Movers Shakers.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Okay, now, as you heard me say just now, annual inflation has dropped. It's below 5%, I think the first time since August last year, but monthly inflation was slightly up from February in Indonesia. So what is your assessment of Indonesia's inflation levels? Is the slight increase in monthly inflation concerning at all?
Okay, Mas Krishna. As we all know, I think it's normal that every Ramadan month in Indonesia that inflation is rising. So because every Ramadan and also Idul Fitri, there's an increase in demand, and that's leading to a higher prices in many goods and also services. But in this case, in the latest update from BPS, as we can see that the monthly inflation is 0.18%. If I compare it to last year's Ramadan's periods, last year in March, if I'm not mistaken, is 0.66%. So it's a lot higher. It's like 3 or 4 times higher compared to this month, the latest inflation in March. That actually can also raise concerns. So the concern is not always when the inflation is high, but when inflation is too low, where actually the period it used to be high, it also can also be a concern. And my concern is more about the purchasing power, that it seems to be weakening recently, especially since the beginning of this year. And if I compare it with other indicators like retail sales index, which is the leading indicators for domestic consumptions, there is a very, very significant deceleration of retail sales index recently, especially in the first quarter of this year. Only 1% increase compared to over 12% increase in the same quarter last year. So there is a drop, or at least a very significant deceleration. So I think there is quite clear signs that the purchasing power in the beginning of this year is actually weakening.
So, I mean, according to your analysis and the data that you have seen, you're saying that there's a drop in purchasing power in Indonesia. What is that telling you, or what is that telling us about the Indonesian economy? Because so far, there has been optimism abound. Indonesia's economy has reopened after the COVID-19 pandemic restrictions were relaxed. But now you're saying that purchasing power is down. What's that saying?
Yeah, because the domestic consumption or private consumption in Indonesia is actually the largest contributor to the Indonesian economy, about 60%. So a strong purchasing power matters a lot in Indonesia. So if we look at the Indonesian economic growth last year, 5.3%. Many of the contributors of the growth is due to external factors like net exports. Yeah. But the drive to surplus of trade balance in Indonesia this year actually slowing down because of the lower commodity prices. So domestic consumption is very important to actually to at least to maintain the economic growth not far from the 5%. So if the purchasing power is weakening this year, so there is a sign that economic growth will not reach 5% in this year.
Okay. Do you have maybe any hints as to why purchasing power is going down?
Well, I think it's quite reasonable, given that inflation has been rising since the early last year, since early 2022, because of different factors, external factors like the Russia and Ukraine war that leads to an increase in many commodities, including oil and also wheat and etc. And recently, in September last year, the government also increased the domestic oil prices, and of course that drive inflation even higher. and that means the purchasing power also impacted by the higher inflation.
Okay, so I mean, with that being said, do you not see inflation in Indonesia on a downward trend? Because annual inflation, according to the data, now it's below 5%, the first time since last August. But it seems like you're saying that purchasing power is down because of high inflation. So is there no downward trend in inflation in Indonesia?
Yeah. So far, I think there's a strong indications that there will be a downward trend in inflation this year,
Okay.
and we predict that this year inflations will be about 2 to 3%, or I can say about 3%, which is about only half of the inflations last year. You know that last year inflations, the total of 2022's inflation is about 5.5%.
Yeah.
So now we predict this year is only about 3%.
Okay. Now, sticking on inflation, you were mentioning how high inflation is still impacting purchasing power. Demand is not so high because prices are still high based on your analysis. So when we're looking at the BPS reports, the recent reports, and you see the different components of goods and services contributing inflation, which groups stand out to you and potentially raise concerns of prices still being too high and remaining high?
Well, yeah. As I said, the monthly inflation in March is actually quite low, 0.18%, which is relatively low in the Ramadan period. But if we look at the components, there are two components that I think that has contributed to the inflation, which is the food and also transportation. And it's also typical every Ramadan and Idul Fitri that the inflations of the food components and also transportation is high. But recently, I think the rate of inflations in transportation is higher than usual. So that means that actually the mobility that we will also see in the next few weeks, I think it will be more costly because of the higher transportation costs.
Okay, now transportation costs is also, of course, linked to fuel and energy costs. And there has been some concern lately, especially since last Sunday, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and other OPEC plus member countries, they announced further cuts to their production. So talk to us about the impact of the production cuts to global oil prices.
Yeah. I think the impact we have already experienced now because in the last few days, this week, I think we can see that the oil prices have rise to above 80% because a few weeks ago or even last week the prices were still lower than $80 per barrel. I mean, so the impacts for especially significant for oil net importing countries like Indonesia, because we import more oil, meaning that we have to pay more to buy oil from overseas, and that also not only impact on the government's ability to pay the subsidy for the subsidized oil, but also put pressures on the SOEs, Pertamina as well, that maintains or manage the oil distributions and also productions in Indonesia. So it will be bad for oil net importing countries like Indonesia, and also for the U.S. because the U.S. is, as we know right now, is fighting inflation. So higher oil prices will means that the U.S. government, especially the Federal Reserve, needs to fight harder to fight against inflation. So that means that they is probably to raise more interest rates, and that will impact on emerging countries like Indonesia as well.
Okay, in your projection and Core Indonesia's projection, how high could oil prices go up following these latest production cuts by OPEC plus countries? Do you think it could go above $90 or even hit $100 a barrel again?
Well, It is probably can reach $90, but I'm not really sure whether it can reach $100. The thing is, because the cut is about 1 million barrels per day, which is about 1% of the world's total production. So the world's total production each day is about 100 million barrels. So 1% production, I think, will not impact too much on the price, but it can be up to $90 if the China's recovery is even faster than expected. Because as we know, right now China is reopening the economy, and we expect more demand from China, which means that can push the oil prices even higher. But right now, the recovery of Chinese economy is a bit slower, so that will not necessarily impact the oil price very soon. But if we can see maybe in the coming months, it is still possible that China can affect more on the oil prices. That means that the oil prices can go even higher than $90.
All right, so you're forecasting $90 and above, but perhaps not quite $100. But if it does hit $90 and above, how will this affect fuel prices in Indonesia?
Yeah. Well, fuel prices in Indonesia is maintained and also regulated by the government. So as long as it's not too high, like for example, $100 a barrel or more, I think the government still have the capability, the capacity to subsidize especially the subsidized oil prices, like the Pertalite, for example. So the fuel prices in Indonesia, I think, as long as it's not above $100 a barrel, I think will stay the same, especially for the subsidized oil prices. But for the oil that is not subsidized, like Pertamax and Dexlite, etc., I think it will be floating following the global oil prices. So that will still impact on the Indonesian consumers, but it's more on the richer consumers rather than the majority of the middle and low consumers.
All right. Well, as we know, Pertalite is the most widely used type of fuel in Indonesia, and if you are saying that if it does not hit $100, it will remain at 10,000 rupiah per liter.